All right, everybody, welcome to Theory Underground and to Why Left with co-host Benjamin Studebaker. How's it going, Benjamin?
It's great to be here. I'm ready to roll.
Awesome. So this is the episode about democracy, and because you and Daniel were having so much fun jamming over the last few days, I thought, wow, this topic of democracy, it goes deep. You guys have a lot of thoughts on it. And I thought I was particularly interested in it because Daniel was talking about Tocqueville versus people's common conceptions of democracy. But Benjamin just did a seminar at Theory Underground, right? So the March seminar was on the topic of democracy. And so I was thinking, because Benjamin just did that, maybe he could, Benjamin, I don't know, do you want to share a little bit about that before we'll turn it over to Daniel and we could kind of pick his brains about what he's doing? And, because he's kind of a guest on our podcast for the first time ever. He's been at Theory Underground plenty of times, but for people who listen to Why Left and not uh, the whole back catalog of everything at Theory Underground, I just wanted to say, yeah, this is Daniel, and you can hear Benjamin and I. You can hear me say a lot of nice things about Daniel on a previous episode. For now, we'll just say he's a cool guy. Let's get after it.
Well, it's a thrill to be here. Why Left is awesome, so thank you for having me. Goodness.
Yeah, it's great to have you on, Daniel. The seminar that I did about democracy was really focused on the very, very wide range of different ways democracy can be understood, many of which are contradictory and don't fit together neatly, or if you do want to put them together, it's challenging. It requires a lot of work. I went through accounts that were more institutional, more procedural. I went through accounts that thought of democracy more as a value. I went through accounts that emphasize the epistemic quality of democracy, questions about what can the demos know? Can the demos know more than any particular individual or smaller group of people? We went through just a huge range of things. We talked about direct democracy, representative democracy, ancient democracy, modern democracy, republicanism. We went through so many different things. So I'm excited to hear where Daniel wants to put Tocqueville today. I could think of a few possible places for him to go, but I want to hear where Daniel wants to put him.
Sweet. And then before we go back to you, Daniel, I also wanted to shout out the other people listening in and then see if Nance, I don't know if you got your camera and everything working yet, Nance, but yes, our other infamous co-host here at Theory Underground, Nance is in the house. He and I just got here to Nashville. We've been driving for the last 9 hours. I feel like I did an MSTU, even though it was just driving all day, but I feel absolutely loopy. And so I hope no one holds it against me too much. But Nance, how you doing, man? What do you think about
Great, man. I'm not sure if my levels are good. But yeah, I'm doing great. I'm here. It's great to, I mean, just the other day we were with Benjamin and Daniel in the same shared space, and it was special, man. And we're doing this thing where we're kind of taking these conversations, and I've been saying for a while now, it's about real virtuality. Everybody's hyped on virtual reality headsets, and everybody watches movies like Johnny Mnemonic and The Matrix. But we're out here doing real virtuality. And it's great. It's great to have collaborators, fellow travelers, co-conspirators, companions, compadres, compatriots, and to do this. Like, we were just in the same physical space. We had this overflowing conversation, and then we're looping it back around. We're bringing it online. I know David was privy to some of it, even though Michelle is camera off, she's here too, and she was also part of that physical conversation. Like, it's just great. It really is amazing. Like, we're playing with the medium in really awesome and amazing ways. So I'm happy to be able to take part in this.
And just so you know, no one saved the phone number there, but that phone number is actually just Anne. So Anne's in the call while she's running an errand at Best Buy. With that said, Daniel, can you tell us a little bit about Tocqueville and really play it down for dummies like me? Like what I understand he wrote a book about democracy in America. I understand that he was an early French sociologist, but could you tell us a little bit about why a lot of people who study political science or philosophy really love him and why they keep going back to him?
No, magnificent. And it's a pleasure to be here. And like Nance says, it's incredible. We were all together and here we are. You know, again, real online, I think is a really nice way to put it. I think that's very important, this kind of continuum that keeps the conversation going. Now, Tocqueville is fascinating because I also think that he was someone who genuinely wanted to learn, which often is actually not always common when someone is engaged in sociology or a kind of political investigation. He came to America. He wanted to see what was going on. And also he has many sort of ideas, for example, that only aristocrats can learn. You know, only the upper class can maybe be that of which can guide a society. But there's this idea of this new possibility that has arisen, and he wants to go and investigate it himself. And there are images of him on the Mississippi, I believe, who's on these writing and thinking through all these different topics. And one of the reasons I like Tocqueville very much as well is because there is not this sharp, he's going to the people to see, he's going to these small towns, these civic sort of organizations and seeing how they are operating. Which very often instead, like if we just ask what is democracy, then we might just say, well, it's some sort of format of voting or some sort of representative and different things. But what exactly is it that the people experience democracy as? And one of the wonderful lines that comes out of Sheldon Walden, he's a great Tocqueville scholar, is there was this point where Tocqueville is kind of like, maybe the middle class really can govern a state. Like, whoa, is that actually possible? And you see this, and he's recording his experiences, on the ground experiences of how people that are caught in this democratic spirit are operating and how they approach one another. But another reason, so there's this, and just from my own personal interest, there's this real paying attention, almost like a photographer, almost like this just kind of on the ground seeing what is occurring. But also, in my opinion, Tocqueville, because we had that wonderful conversation on tragic sociology and Benjamin's incredible points on politics as intractable disagreements, which I think is very, very important. There is a certain tragic thinking in Tocqueville. There is a certain realism. There's a sort of, you see the way that Wolin describes it, and I do like this. And before I forget, I really appreciate Studebaker's emphasis on democracy is one of those things we all know what it is until we're asked about it. And then it's like Socrates said, well, what do you mean by justice? Well, everyone knows what justice is. Oh, really? Okay. Where democracy has this sort of ever fragmenting understanding of it. The thing that I do like, the way that Wolin basically put Sheldon, he says, in Tocqueville, democracy is kind of an event, like this event that occurs, that if you don't have the capacities, you lose, right? It appears and then it can go. And what's interesting about Wolin is that democracy has only ever at this point been an event. It has not been something that we have sustained. And the moments we have it, unfortunately, there can be a direction of people to create then the society that loses those capacities. And I think the key example, and this is what caught my attention with Tocqueville, because just to give some more history, I've been reading for Belonging Again, the part one. Tocqueville is one of those thinkers. You read his book on the French Revolution, you read Democracy in America, 10 years ago, but you didn't really read it. There's so many books like that you read, but you didn't really read. And then you come back later and it's like, oh, I guess I didn't read this book. Funny how that works. But, James Hunter talked about the necessity of democracy moving in the direction of a discussion of first principles. Can we have people discuss their first principles versus just policy disagreements? Because if we don't do that, pluralism will tear itself apart, right? And which makes me think, of course, of Benjamin's work and this kind of idea that people have these different, bases for their thinking. And if we don't take that seriously and we can't discuss that, then we're never going to arrive at anything, right? So there was this idea of, oh, well, maybe democracy is this thing that we don't actually do. We might talk about it, but maybe at this point it's something that we're not really aware of what it was. And when Wolin started describing, and you see it in Tocqueville, this notion of democracy as this event, Which here's the critical idea. An event, you can kind of in philosophy, there are thinkers who use the term event like Bourdieu and et cetera, so forth, that it's this event that was unexpected, that appeared, and there it was, and it was an opportunity. And why it appeared is not always easy to say, and why it goes is not always easy to say, but it was an event. There's a real sense that something happened that was actual. And why did it happen? And where did it go? And what we see on this idea is that when democracy as an event, it's where the social imagination, because the other thing we were talking about is the line between the political and the social is a line that we should be careful to draw, because once we do that, we separate them, then it's not clear what the social is about or the political, because it doesn't become about these discussions on intractable disagreements, for example. And when you look at democracy as an event that occurs when there's a malleability of the social imagination, where people actually do imagine, we could do things differently, couldn't we? Things actually could be different. Then there is a certain receptivity to people in their social relations interacting in a different way. Now, it does seem that for Tocqueville, a lot of democracy at event has something to do with the frontier. You know, there's the Turner thesis, this idea that we actually are in a new space. So who knows what we could do, right? There's an openness of the social imagination. But the reason I also very much appreciate Tocqueville is because he also identifies what is likely to be the erosion of this social imagination. And it has a lot to do with commerce. It has a lot to do with moneyed interests. And it has a lot to do with also, the way I kind of put it, is that if someone comes along and you're having a actual democratic discussion and you arrive at, as Studebaker has emphasized, the mechanic of decision-making, and the guy who has money doesn't like where he's going, then there's a temptation now. There's a temptation to say, well, I don't need to follow that because I'm richer. I have more status than you, right? At the moment, and so there's a democracy as this event can only be sustained if people agree not to bring into the consensus outside variables that supposedly give them authority beyond the exchange that is occurring. To simply say, well, my family, we're powerful. I don't need to listen to this, right? And so that sort of tension that people have to be able to hold to not bring in something like their money or their status or whatever is a key for me, and then I'll close, is a key insight of Tocqueville to see how the event of democracy, in requiring a human capacity, as we were talking about, if it can't do that, then the event will be lost, because people can't handle resisting the temptation to bring in some reason not to give in to the consensus. And then, of course, you can rationalize certain ideas of, well, politics is actually about, say, helping commerce or trade agreements or opening up new markets, right? That's what the political is about. And that seems plausible, right? I mean, it's not out of hand crazy. You need to have some sort of trade agreements. So that creates an avenue where democracy can now be lost. That seems like you're still doing some sort of governing, but now it is completely in the business of thinking in terms of law for the sake of, say, markets and capital and the merchant class and all of these different things, which then takes us away, say, from a democracy as event in a democracy that is dealing with these intractable disagreements. So that tragic element of Tocqueville, the method of Tocqueville, the fact that I was personally at a time trying to kind of deal with this question, what is democracy, and seeing this sort of framing and way that he puts it forth, and also the way that Tocqueville brings together the social and the political is of great interest to me. And also then another characteristic is there's something with Tocqueville clearly sees, in my opinion, something about democracy that requires conversation versus communication, as we were talking about yesterday. There is something about democracy that is indivisible from conversation. So that would mean the following: if you have a society that does not have a conversation, then it cannot have democracy. If it only has communication, then it will not have democracy, because you won't have the capacities to actually socially think through something and then to actually follow the decision of the mechanism. So those are some thoughts, and I think Tocqueville's great.
Cool. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, and by the way, I forgot to kind of mention also, this is one of those sort of bonus class sessions that's also happening for students. So we do have a representative student from the Boise State student body here, which is fantastic. And, one of the reasons that we'll keep this to a strict hour and 15 tops as far as that goes. And so my main goal is to kind of facilitate, I think, the discourse. But I do want to make sure to stir the pot in case anybody's eyes start getting a little too dry. And so I don't think nothing, and Daniel, nothing about what you said was eye drying, but also if a person were really, really new to these subject matters, well then, maybe some of the significance could be lost. For instance, it sounds to me like you're saying Tocqueville is doing something that, yes, a lot of sociologists don't do, which is like a very serious engagement with politics in like this sort of like, in fact, maybe we could even say it's a sociology of politics or of apolitics or of a certain political project, whereas a lot of sociology isn't like focused on a political project or whatever. That might be a way of thinking about it, it sounds like. But to bring it back around here, I guess maybe this is a question for you, Benjamin, because I also just want you to go in whatever direction you already were going to. I don't want to lead anyone here, but I also do want to just say I am curious about critiques of democracy, because so far everyone's just talking about it in a very neutral way, and I would like to see someone come out raising some very, I guess, devil's advocate positions, or just coming out against democracy. I kind of want to hear it, because if no one else will do it, I'll have to play that guy, and I really don't want to right now, because I said I'm loopy, so who knows what that could be like. So, but Benjamin, you just taught Plato and Aristotle, and they both have their own critiques of it. So, maybe that could factor in a little bit.
Yeah. So Tocqueville, whenever I talk about Tocqueville, I always start in with what is it that is the problem for Tocqueville? And it's the French Revolution and the inability of France to find any kind of stable political system that can work across time. And what's happened in France? They can't go back to the old aristocracy because they liquidated it. So they no longer have this aristocratic base for a feudal monarchy or for something which would in some way incorporate or call back to bits and bobs of that old regime. But each time they try to get away from monarchy and construct some kind of republic, they find that that doesn't work either. They're not able to actually keep together the population for any length of time. It fragments, it infights, and so some king or emperor ends up becoming the solution to this period of anarchy. And so France keeps going back and forth between despotism and anarchy, and there's this question, is there some other way? Is there some other social base that can be constructed that might be functional for France? And a lot of the French liberals at the time are looking at the British system and going, is it possible to graft that on, to maybe create something like that in France? And part of what the whole Democracy in America mission is to take a look at how the American system is working and to think about to what degree is this something that can actually work? And is it a model? Is it something you could do in France? So as Tocqueville is looking at it, there's a focus on how it works, but there's also a focus on what are the conditions for it, and does France have those conditions? So the major conditions are this democratic society, a society where it actually does seem to be the case that there's a rough equality in terms of political power, which is, of course, connected to, but not quite the same as, a rough equality in terms of the economy. So you don't have enormously huge inequalities economically or politically in the United States in the first half of the 19th century, especially if you're comparing the United States to the European powers at the same time. And this produces, if you think about today, we have a big chunk of the population with a university education and a big chunk of the population without a university education. And we have a bunch of billionaires, a bunch of incredibly rich people, and then lots of people who have no property at all, who don't even own any farmland. This is a time period where there's lots of small landholders in the United States, lots of small merchants, crafts. What we would call capitalism has not been firmly established in the United States yet. So you still have something that looks like a commercial society with small farmers, small merchants and landholders. There are a few relatively well-to-do rich people, but these people are nothing like as rich as we would subsequently get. And you don't have the old nobility or the old church as you still had in many European empires at the same time. So you have this appearance of a kind of relatively homogeneous demos that is relatively homogeneous in terms of its life experience and is therefore able to have a discussion within itself. And so one of the major questions, even at the time, is whether something like that exists anywhere else on Earth. And can that be sustained for any length of time? So even insofar as it seems to work in the United States, can it continue to work? Or will this demos eventually fracture and fragment and become more and more inegalitarian? And if this happens within the social and political base, if the economy becomes more stratified, and political influence also becomes more stratified along with that, will you still be able to have the same kinds of mechanisms function? And if you don't have the same kinds of mechanisms functioning at the social level, will the state, the federal state, have to become more involved in some way to counteract these emerging inequalities and emerging splits? And if that happens, then won't power become centralized around the federal state? And if power becomes centralized around the federal state, would that be really altogether different from power being centralized around the King of France or the Emperor of France? And if that were to happen, wouldn't the United States then replicate in a somewhat different form the same series of problems which France has been having? And so while Tocqueville is interested in democracy in America and excited about it, he also has these concerns. And these concerns, I think, are really a major part of why Tocqueville is as intriguing as he is. And it's in part because Tocqueville is this aristocratic French guy who has a certain level of remove, that he's able to see both what's distinctive, weird, and different about the United States, how it's not like a European country in ways that are kind of exciting, but also the fragility of it, the conceits of it, the degree to which it doesn't recognize that what it has made is fragile and prone to internal trouble. The usual critique of democracy is that to have it function well, it requires a very, very contingent and difficult to sustain situation. And then as soon as that situation starts to get out of control, you have to make some kind of intervention into it. Now, this is if you're understanding democracy in terms of a rough equality of economic and political power. Once you start to understand democracy in other ways, like, say, just competitive multi-party elections that guarantee elite circulation, then you can say that you have a healthy democracy without any of this stuff, really, that Tocqueville talks about. And one of the things we see in the 20th century is a move toward this more elite theory understanding of democracy as a mechanism for circulating elites rather than a mechanism for allowing a demos to rule.
All right, who's gonna come out? Who's gonna come out against democracy now? We need someone to play this game. What about it leveling everything? I don't know. Nance, do you like democracy? Are you like, do you think democracy will save us? Do we need more democracy? Did I'm not sure if he's not in the camera view. I think he's like outside of the camera frame, setting up
Well,
his,
I'll say on this point,
YouTube.
Dave, the things that
Yeah.
you do to try to save democracy gut it on many of the conceptualizations of it. So once you start noticing that this inequality is popping up, the things that you would do to try to deal with the inequality involve concentrating power around particular entities, which can then try to sustain the distribution necessary. And in doing this, you create new maldistributions to make up for the ones that you think you're starting to see. So instead of getting back to some kind of idyllic democratic equality, what happens is that this image of democracy becomes this phantasm that people try to in some way return to. And they try to return to it by creating yet new, different kinds of major inequalities. Because the only way to concentrate enough decision-making power so that you can try to restore the equality is to generate an enormous inequality of power.
Yeah, I don't know about democracy. I think I know I'm supposed to say yes, I want democracy. Like I know that's what I'm supposed to say, but I'm not so sure because it does involve kind of taking the problems and maybe like reifying them and fetishizing them and then abstracting solutions that in theory might work, but then kind of creating new forms of centralized power that serve to undo the very thing that you're trying to accomplish. I know that democracy in all its forms, except for maybe now when Benjamin was going through citizenship and kind of explaining these classical ideas of democracy, I did get a bit wistful, and I did, you know, start to long for this idea that was, I think, my understanding of the lectures you gave, like it was predicated on the understanding of the subjects of the democracy. They understood they had a responsibility to uphold that democracy, and that democracy rested on their efforts to honor the collective that was the state or the society or the city. And it seems to me that in the world we live in today, people do think that democracy is this abstraction that kind of comes down from on high, and it doesn't involve much responsibility, and it's just sunshine and rainbows and lollipops. Do sunshine, lollipops, and I don't know, but it is a bit scary to say I don't care about democracy, but maybe I'll be that guy and say maybe there's something else, and I know I'm not the only one here, but for the purposes of right now, I will be the guy that says maybe there's something else that democracy tries to address, that democracy tries to provide, and maybe it requires a bit of out of the box thinking. So no, I don't care. I don't want democracy. I'll be the bad guy. So you don't have to, Dave.
It's really nice not to have to be. I can just be like a good guy. I'm just a good guy today. And so while I'm on that, I wanted to say we've got a few other people here now. A few people popped in over the last 10 minutes or so. Wanted to shout out Will, our road dog and documentarian here on the tour. Also Rody. Yes. What's up, Will? Good to see you. Now, we'll have like a little Q&A, unlike normal, towards the tail end here, where at least a couple people get to ask questions. But for right now, though, I kind of want to just go right back to you, Daniel.
Well, I think the key for me is this idea that the conditions of democracy are very, very difficult and rare. Like that's to me critical. Like for me, the greatest critique of democracy is that the conditions of it are so hard. Like we speak about democracy as if it is not conditional per se, or that it is non-contingent. Once you create it, then it just kind of takes care of itself. Well, if it's taking care of itself, then it has actually gone away from the social problem. It's gone in the direction of some sort of, say, capital or centralization, et cetera, so forth, right? And I think also the greatest problem, and this is why this idea of democracy as an event that appears and then goes away, that seems like we don't sustain the conditions of it. And then you could say democracy becomes really bad because you're convincing yourself that you're doing it while you're not. And then you get attached to that and you don't want to admit otherwise. You make it worse and worse and you get this auto-cannibalism. I always have to use the word auto-cannibalism at least once in a discussion. It's a quota of mine, as you know. So it's really important. So that is the problem. To me, democracy has a tendency towards some sort of centralization. And once that occurs, as Benjamin's point, then, you know, what is it really democracy at this point, right? It doesn't. And also, too, once it centralizes, you then have a thing that creates habits of the people out of the work of the social, out of the social relationships in favor of simply what they need to do to participate in that central power, right? So like we were saying, this habit formation that occurs, that's very, very problematic. So two examples for me of what democracy, if it cannot address, is going to always merely be an event that then makes it very difficult to even see how it existed, right? You know, so one example that Koratani makes is he has a book on Iona, and he contrasts the differences between Ionian democracy and Athenian democracy. Now, I will not claim any expertise on it or anything like that, but one of the things that he points out is that a key to Iona's democracy, and, you know, supposedly many of the great philosophers come from Iona, from this sort of tradition, is that Iona didn't have a standing army. That's one of the reasons why they were able to avoid centralization and actually have a more social-based democracy. But that also meant they were sitting ducks when they were invaded, right? Because they didn't have the standing army, right? Well, crap. Aren't you, if you have some sort of standing army, going to have some centralizing force or some to coordinate that standing army or to make sure that people are part of it? So does this mean in order to avoid the centralization that kind of tends to remove democracy or get rid of it, you have to be a sitting duck and not have a standing army? Oh, that's an issue. Now, I love, like was being mentioned, Benjamin's wonderful work on citizenship. A way that the classical world dealt with this is by giving citizenship to people in the army, right? Like, okay, well, then that gives you a sort of unique status where you can participate in the democracy, participate in the society or governmental structure. You also have stakes. You also have, involvement, time to think, et cetera, so forth, and all those other things, right? But there's this kind of idea that there's always going to be some sort of tension between the possibility of democracy and, say, self-defense or the ability to defend yourself. How do you navigate those things? And then, of course, if you have an army that is defending you, how do you fund it? Where does the money come? Well, now we have taxes. Then you have training people and all of those other things. So that's one issue that seems to make it very difficult to have a democracy, is the issue of defense. And I should also note too, I also think it's interesting, I should just note this, Karatani at the end of Structures of World History, he starts talking about kind of the perpetual peace of Kant, and there's also this kind of idea that eventually, it's very Hobbesian according to him. The reason why the world will have to eventually all get along is in some sort of liberal fashion almost, is precisely because otherwise we all die. Right? We're all going to be destroyed. So we have to kind of figure out how to get along. And the perpetual peace, he claims, of Kant is very Hobbesian. Well, as that being a possible avenue to bring back the social, I think this is where Benjamin's idea of this democracy of despair is really important, where it just ends up where we get comfortable with this kind of despair and it doesn't actually go anywhere. But then also, too, if we're able to believe that there are no such things as intractable disagreements, then we can go off to technology or church or whatever and believe that we don't need to worry about the political, but of course the political is going to chase you down, right? So you're going to eventually have to deal with these problems. So the second point, and then I'll stop, that makes democracy seemingly extremely difficult to maintain. So the first one is basically the fear of being invaded and destroyed, right? You want to be protected. You want to take care of that. And that leads to movement of centralization and so on and so forth. One could, so there's that. The second is, for me, the vast moral disagreement. If you have people who have like slavery is okay, and other people are like slavery is not okay, and you are like, how do we, we need to resolve this. We need to stop this great moral atrocity. Well, then that leads to, another military thing, like the American Civil War as an example or something, right? Where there's this movement towards centralization because there's a moral atrocity. Or now, of course, this gets into the question of what the American Civil War is about. That's, we can get into that. But let's just imagine, for example, you have a world where people, and I'll stop, a world where people think it is all right to say use AI to do pornographic material of whoever they want, and it's okay, right? And other people are like, no, that's not okay, and they get really upset about that. That tension then creates the notion of these people are moral monsters, or we are too much disagreement, so then we either have to separate or we have to fight. So this moral real comes in, almost real in the Lacanian sense, kind of breakthrough. That is very hard to deal with. So if I were to say what I think are critiques of democracy, is that it is the capacities to handle those situations are very, very steep, and perhaps it is unrealistic to think that most people would be able to have those capacities, perhaps. Now, there are ways to respond to that and to address to that, but those are things that come to mind.
These are great points. A couple of things that I thought of in listening to that. One of the things that really distinguishes the early period of American history is the musket and rifles era. In the musket and rifles era, you can have these militias that are all over the country. And these militias are armed comparably well to any standing army that you could create. And if the militias train regularly, then they'll be able to fire the guns a comparable number of times per minute, or times per 10 minutes. And that means they'll be able to stand up under fire to some kind of army that you might send to fight them. The only real difference is going to be artillery And in that period, the cannons, while significant and important and a major advantage for anyone who's got them, they're not overwhelmingly decisive all of the time in every case. There are horses in all sorts of communities. It's not that difficult to get a horse. It's not that difficult to field a certain amount of cavalry. You can do this very easily. And you can have many, many different military forces dispersed all over the place. When Tocqueville talks about France and the king in France, I always like to compare it to Mordor, like this tower that's just in a complete wasteland. There's nothing else except the tower. And so the tower is, of course, where all of your attention goes. Is it looking at me? Is it watching me? What do I have to do? Is it going to come after me? All of your attention is on the tower. And in the American system, what he likes about it are these counties and townships and little localities and all these different little units. And even if you have a tower amongst a bunch of other buildings all comparably tall to it, that tower doesn't dominate everything in the way that it would if you've gotten rid of all of those different intervening bits and bobs and parts and pieces. But what makes all of those intervening bits and bobs and parts and pieces able to really hold their own against the tower is that each one of them has got militias, has got, not just, say, state guard troops, but also local town, village, county militias all over the place. And once you go to modern warfare, you really can't have that kind of distribution of hard military power. It's not possible to have it. And if it's not possible to have that kind of military power, you can get a certain part of the way there in economic terms or commercial terms with the way that you distribute wealth throughout a country. But one of the consequences of the centralization of military power in one particular region tends to be the centralization of economic power in the areas that are most relevant for the maintenance of that centralized military power. And one of the things I think we've seen very much in the 20th century is the driving of economic growth by the military. Not in the sense that the defense budget is an enormous percentage of US GDP. It's not, it's only 3%. But because there's so much concentrated research and development investment that goes into the federal military, there are all of these knockdown effects over time in all sorts of other areas of the economy, because so many other parts of the economy are dependent for new research, new technology on stuff that is ultimately downstream from things that began only available to people who have security clearance, only available to people who have been vetted by the state. And this stuff only gradually trickles down. In the 19th century, it was a whole different situation because you really did have a very, very wide array of people able to field, competitive militias that really could, make a difference. Those Southerners were working primarily off the ordinary people who lived in the States who had guns. They were not in a situation where they were heavily mass producing, enormous numbers of, gigantic howitzer shells. They were not using Gatling guns. They were not, only very, very much in the Civil War, just a little bit of Gatling guns here and there, toward the end. So these things I think really just aren't thought about enough. When people start talking about, oh, we could have something like that again, there's this interstate conflict. The competition among the states produced a weird era in military armaments that was much more egalitarian and rewarded getting together very large numbers of people. Because if you could get 1,000 people together with muskets or 1,000 people together with rifles, there was not really a way of countering that without a comparable number of guys. Maybe if you had a cannon and you got it positioned in the right spot with enough distance between the cannon and those guys, you could manage to use the cannon to get an advantage, but you had to be kind of smart with it. Military commanders had to be smart with their cannons to outfox these revolutionaries with their muskets and their rifles. And we're just not in any kind of comparable situation. But a lot of people pretend that we are, and they think that the small arms that they keep at home allow them to go toe-to-toe with the federal state. But this is a kind of LARPing fantasy. It has nothing to do with where things are now.
Well, I was just going to jump on in and say, brilliant. I mean, for me, the Second Amendment is the kind of way you deal with the between space of Iona and Athens. Because how do you have some sort of self-defense that ultimately doesn't become centralization? The unexplored point here is that the fate of democracy and the state of military technology are strongly tied together. And if military technology becomes super advanced, well, then there's no way that you can have each individual funding this to compete with other nations and other things to defend themselves or all of these different problems. So military technology, the state of military technology is another thing that democracy is notably vulnerable to being thrown off by, unless you simply accept vulnerability. Like you just accept vulnerability. You say, well, we're just going to be vulnerable then. We are going to be, if someone chooses to invade us, there's nothing we can do and we will die, which is easy to say if it's you maybe laying down your life versus your kids or your neighbor or someone else, right? Pacifism is easy if it's you versus people you care about, right? That's kind of always the test. And then, of course, there's a question, is that really moral, right? Is that a moral position, et cetera, so forth. But this opens a lot of questions, but we don't always, I'll stop with this. We don't always appreciate how much of history is a reflection of advancements in military technology. Like there's arguments to be made. Forgive me if I get the details wrong, but one of the reasons why World War I was so traumatizing is I believe it's the invention of the bullet that can turn and thus go a lot farther than they are used to, completely wiped out the strategies that they had, right? And then you're doing these trenches and you're like, what? This is not what warfare looked like, right? There's this change in the technology that changes the expectations. And then, well, now that we know this is possible, we have to change government. We have to build up to make sure it's not possible. And then I would, the last thing I'll say as well is, I think also that possibility of total war, also which kind of builds up in the 20th century, also is imaginable because of this new military technology. And then actually, as you get away from an idea or don't have to even begin with a notion of democracy as dealing with intractable disagreements, instead it becomes the fulfillment of some sort of philosophical ideals, say freedom or something like that. Well, freedom can go around the world and can involve everyone. It can totalize everyone into that mission. Where if I have to represent, say, a single state or a single county and their needs for food and their needs for healthcare, then I can't expand the conflict or the call beyond that material condition, right? But as you move to these kind of abstract philosophical concepts, you can move beyond them. And then if you don't have people who have the ability to talk about them and have a decision, a mechanism of decision to keep those from leading to a totality, you have a race to the top that binds everyone together while they are then equipped with this very extreme military technology. And then it's unimaginable that you return to democracy. It's too dangerous, and we don't even have that precedent by which to think it. So the point you made, I think, is very, very important.
Yeah, and this is why a lot of the socialists were interested in creating a world republic, a world federal republic, so that they wouldn't have to deal with military competition from well-armed capitalist states that could get them into the kind of fight which would compel them to centralize power around an armed state.
I'm gonna come in now and maybe just throw a few things out here and see what you can all do with it. But basically, I want to say that, I might be being the good guy in this conversation, which means I'm pro democracy 100%, because if you're a bad guy in this world, it means you're against democracy, right? And so you deserve to die, actually, if you are against democracy. In fact, anybody who really has a problem with it should probably be tortured in Guantanamo Bay, and the erection and defense of Guantanamo, as well as the Patriot Act and every kind of bill or policy like it, should probably not be up for conversation in our democracy, because in our democracy, the people who challenge democracy are dealt with outside of the purview of democracy, and it's not up to any of us, and our voice doesn't really matter in that. But that's why some people will come along and say, well, that's why we need real democracy. And so, of course, when we think of that, we think of Occupy Wall Street or the Democratic Socialists of America or any kind of mass populist movement, whether it's from above or below, whether it's grassroots or astroturfed, it tends to say, you know, we want freedom, we want democracy. Like there'll be other, you know, justice is another term, you know, of course, but the idea is like we the people, it's for the people, you know, a people united will never be divided, right? Like that's the kind of chant that you'll hear, right? When you go, yeah. And it does make our hearts feel full, like we just feel proud, like, yeah, freedom, democracy, good, yes. But then, of course, once you've seen it get weaponized a lot, you definitely get jaded about how it gets weaponized. The only real question I think here is the goal a real democracy, or is the goal, or should the goal be something else? And then the part of me that's kind of blackpilled about politics in general is just like, does it even matter? Isn't it kind of just presupposing democracy to even ask if our opinion matters in the first place? Because I think the accelerationist point, at least, would be it doesn't. You know, it's things are moving too fast to talk about it. So we can all sit around and talk about it, but it's, you know, the owl of Minerva. It only can make sense of any of this retroactively, right? And so I don't know. I want to see what you all want to make of that. I see Nance chomping at the bit here, so yeah, take it away, man.
Yeah, man, I'm with you there. But like as we talk about democracy, and we talk about how it does kind of fill our hearts, and it plays to the soft and squishy bits inside of us. I always just, I guess, naively ask the question: does it always come back to, you know, he who has the biggest stick? Like, does it always come back to that? Like, if we're talking about democracy, and if we're talking about like everyone deserves dignity and everyone deserves a chance at actualization and edification and having their needs and desires met, like, does it always come back to the question of force? And I think that's a genuine question, and I think maybe it's exposing my own naivety a little bit, but I would prefer to talk about force if the conversation about democracy is really being had to kind of cover up or disavow the conversation about force. Then I would rather quit than just kind of say, no, I don't care about democracy, but I do care about these things. I care about actualization and edification. I care about people having their needs met. I do care about all these things, but it seems to be the case that we can't talk about that because no one's willing to talk about force and intractable disagreements and the ugly parts of the world that we live in that we must reckon with. We have to be the adults in the room. We can't sit around and satisfy ourselves with utopian ideals. I don't know, and I don't know.
Yeah, force. Certainly force is always in the picture. Force comes into the picture when legitimation doesn't come off. Political systems try to generate enough legitimacy for the decisions they take so that the amount of force that actually has to be used is limited. Now, there's a zone where you have generated an insufficient amount of legitimacy, but you still have some people who will defend the state with force. Those people still are willing to follow the orders. So you have some level of legitimacy, at least with some fragment, so that you can get those people to follow your orders to go out and defend the state. When you really don't have any legitimacy, you give the order and no one obeys you. So at that point, when there's absolutely no legitimacy, the possibility of actually using force is gone. Force comes in when there's very, 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 very little, which is why at the bottom of my scale of levels of legitimacy, I call it liminal rather than none. You know, liminal is where there's a question about, is there even enough to sustain the thing? So in that situation, you might have a bunch of people go out and demand the fall of the government. And the president goes, go shoot those people until they go back to work. And then the troops have to decide whether to obey the order to shoot those people or not. And that's where it becomes liminal. There's a question of whether that order will be obeyed. Is there enough legitimacy left to get the troops to do that? And if the troops split on the question, then you can get a civil conflict. So democracy is a mechanism for generating legitimacy. And democracy plays on particular abstract values that we have. But for democracy to work in the way that people envision it working, it rests on it really being the case that the audience that's necessary to legitimate decision-making be wide enough. Now, sometimes you don't actually need it to be wide, but you pretend anyway that you do. If you pretend anyway that you do, you might be able to generate more legitimacy more easily than if you don't pretend anyway that you do. So sometimes, even though you no longer have the conditions that require democracy, you might nonetheless proceed with the forms because they give you an advantage in terms of legitimation over not proceeding with the forms. So we may be in a situation where we don't have many of what would have been considered historically to be social preconditions for democracy. Nevertheless, it may still have certain advantages in terms of legitimation, especially at a point where other kinds of systems terrify and scare people. And it might be the case that even though you don't need the whole population to agree that the elections are fair, it's actually okay to have large parts of the population that think the whole thing is rigged and it's all a scam. If those people can't be motivated by someone else to challenge the regime, if there's no competing source of legitimacy to democracy, then democracy proceeds even with very, very small amounts of real legitimacy, because there's nothing else on the menu. And so the challenge for the anti-democrat is to put something else on the menu that can actually acquire a sufficient level of legitimacy that when the democracy orders people to do something, this other thing that has been organized or created can say, no, don't do that thing. In fact, go out into the streets and don't go back to work until the regime falls. And in that situation, then, the troops can be given a real choice about what to do. The thing that is missing is anyone who could command anything else. And this is why I was saying the other day, there's no political capacity. There is no one able to take decisions and explain them and generate legitimacy for the decisions they've taken. So we have this rotting thing that disgusts us, and yet it still has more capacity to legitimate its decisions than anything else we can come up with.
Oof. Yeah, that's heavy. And I guess I wanted to bring up the question about oligarchy for you all. All these articles, all these studies keep coming out, or maybe it's the same one and it always gets referenced. But I hear a lot of people referencing at least one study where it's like, this just in, the United States is not a democracy, it's an oligarchy. And whoa, it's like, oh, you mean it's like run by billionaires, for billionaires? I think everyone's aware. Um, but also, this country was not set up to be a democracy. And that's something that people who really like democracy will say as a sort of gotcha. Whereas people, at least Republicans in my life, usually will be pretty quick to be like, no, it's a democratic republic. And so I guess I kind of wanted to ask you, Benjamin, and then Daniel, just kind of a quick what you'd tell either of those people, right? That those are two people in a lot of our lives. I'm not saying that those are the two kinds of people that exist. I'm saying a lot of us who exist in America know one, if not both, of those people, or people who will say those things about democracy, and kind of just what you think about those things, and then we'll be able to take a couple questions and close it out.
Yeah, so of course, if you define democracy as direct democracy of the kind that existed in Athens or of the kind that existed in certain Italian city-states, then of course we've never had it. Then all you can have is the adjective democratic. So something about our system reminds us to some degree or other of those things. Then there's a question of how much should we be reminded of those other things? And how democratic, if it's an adjective, ought it to be? Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party, it's a republic that reminds us in some way of a democracy, in some way. This leaves open a lot of room for how democratic. And in leaving open this room, it also leaves open the room for the possibility of thinking of the system as a mixed regime in the Aristotelian sense, as a system that has a democratic element, but then also other elements, perhaps an oligarchic element, which maybe at the best of times could be framed as an aristocratic element, that operates in tandem, an executive element that might have a sort of monarchical or tyrannical character at different points, depending on how we feel about it. And so at that stage, if you have a mixed regime, you still have a democratic part of it, but that part of it would be in dialogue with other parts. And when people describe it as an oligarchy, they are wanting to emphasize this other part and say that this other part is so dominant and so strong within the mixed regime that it ought to be considered the dominant part, the preponderant part, so much so that the regime should get its name from this part, that the language which names it for the democratic part covers over the kind of regime it really is. So there's a kind of normative emphasis on whichever terminology you use. There's a kind of goal you have for the regime, or there's a way of describing it that you think is useful or that you think is effective. And what I would ask people to do is, rather than kind of dig into their definition like they've learned it from a textbook, to go, well, why is it that I'm drawn to use this language to describe the thing? Is it because this is the way I wish it operated? Is it because this is the way I think it actually does operate? Or am I trying in some way to shake other people up or get their attention or change the way they think? And why am I doing that? What is it in particular I'm trying to do or achieve by doing that? There's lots of different languages we can use to describe this kind of regime. It's really a question of what's useful for us given what we're trying to do.
I think that's very well put. I mean, one of the reasons I like talking about democracy as an event is because it's this idea that it's not given. It comes and goes, right? Oh, you think it's an oligarchy? Well, yeah, because democracy is really hard to maintain. Oh, you think it's not a democracy, it's a democratic republic? Oh, well, of course, because democracy is hard to maintain. It's like, well, then what is democracy? I'm so glad you asked. It's actually more of the realm of the social capacity and your interest, because the problem with the word, I think a lot of people intuit something about democracy that, to say something very banal, is power to the people, right? The people have the power, right? So there's some sort of idea that there's something about that is supposed to be the case, right? And so when we're talking about we've lost something, we're saying that we have lost the ability to, say, control our direction. We don't know where we're going. It's out of our hands. Our lives are not our own, right? And so that emotional feeling, that feeling of abandonment, is what you're simultaneously saying, oh, we want to use that. We want to use the feeling that you feel abandoned to get you involved, but then also make it clear that the thing you want to get involved in is not just, say, voting in the political process or watching MSNBC or Fox News to get informed or whatever. No. What we need to do is bring back the social, this social imagination, this capacity of people to actually, be able to operate in like these political capacities, to think in terms of social, to actually be able to handle, a decision, right? And actually to then give themselves over to the consensus of the group or different things, right? The reason why I like that kind of focus is because, in my opinion, nothing beyond you're only ever going to have some perverted form, if you will, of democracy if you don't have those social conditions. So if we focus on those social conditions, perhaps you will also have, some sort of change on a broader level. But if you don't, well, you had to have those anyway, right? Because even if you introduce something else, that would just fall apart or eventually come in an oligarchy or some other tyrannical authoritarian structure, right? It's like that first things first thing of Lewis, right? If you put first things first, you can get second things also, but if you put second things first, you lose both, right? Like the problem right now, in my opinion, is most ideas of saving democracy has them put a second thing first and you get neither, right? We have to focus on the first thing. And for me, thinkers like Tocqueville, who are really sort of, in my opinion, really bringing democracy as having this sort of, I think Portani's next book is almost like on spirit, like this social spirit, this sort of movement of people who are toward one another in a manner that is really trying to create their own social. If you don't have that, that is within our power to bring about, right? But it's going to involve us being willing to, well, use our time and our energy and to form habits that are alternative to what people think is a good use of time, or that is quote unquote practical or utility or different things. And so in actually then exploring those things outside the realm of which people associate being, say, what you need to do to have a good future, you're also in a funny way increasing freedom, right? Because you're introducing to people the idea that, yeah, actually you could say read Plato or Aristotle or be here at Theory Underground, even if you're not being paid for it. Oh, wait, I'm actually free to do things that aren't acknowledged by wage labor? Yes, you are. So there's an increase of freedom there that is also simultaneously opening up possibilities for the regaining of the social, which is a precondition for any sort of democracy that doesn't ultimately pervert into something, right? And so for me, when people ask or point out like, oh, the system is actually an oligarchy or it's not actually a democracy, it's like, well, yeah, that's to be expected because democracy is an event that has to be sustained by people gaining capacities that can handle it, right? And I like that because then it's an invitation to that person you're speaking to actually then explore doing those things, right? Because you're not saying to them, your intuition that there's some good, if you will, to democracy is wrong. There's some sort of sense that we should be involved, but the way you are directing that sentiment is resulting in a frustration, right? Let's direct it to building capacities to be human, right? Let's bring it there and then work back. Because that, I think, is going to have to be the first thing that opens up other possibilities, but we have to do that first. But I'll stop there.
Ooh, yeah, thank you. Thank you. All right. And like I have already indicated, yeah, on this slightly tighter schedule than normal, trying to keep it within the parameters of a typical class session, which nowadays is insufferably short. I just wanted to, impossibly short, I would even say, stultifyingly short. Definitely not the 3 hour class kind of sessions that Hegel or Heidegger got to partake in. So, with our last, I guess we have 12 minutes here. I wanted to ask the folks here in the chat if anybody's got a question for us, and also Nance, this would be a good time to go as well. But yeah, everyone else, please raise your hands if you'll want to go, and we'll just probably run through the queue and then do some closing remarks. Thank you. Actually, yeah, Ruiz, how about you go first?
Yeah, I just wanted to read out this little quick quote I got out of Neil Postman's "Amusing Ourselves to Death" that I think kind of goes with what we're talking about here. And since he has been coming up the last few days, maybe we can tie a couple things together. I don't know. I'm just going to throw it out there. Alexis de Tocqueville took note of this fact in his Democracy in America, published in 1835. In America, he wrote, parties do not write books to combat each other's opinions, but pamphlets, which are circulated for a day with incredible rapidity and then expire. And he referred to both newspapers and pamphlets when he observed, the invention of firearms equalized the vassal and the noble on the field of battle. The art of printing opened the same resources to the minds of all classes. The post brought knowledge alike to the door of the cottage and of the gate of the palace. So it kind of, I guess it goes to it feels like it goes to a little bit what Danny was saying here at the end. But then I also can't get past the fact that, whoever has the biggest cannons kind of wins. And then I guess the last observation I kind of made here is that he's going from like books to like pamphlets, which is almost like this rapid communication, which we almost have an opportunity to kind of emulate in a way with our social media, except obviously we went way too far with like the 140 characters, I guess. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of throw those thoughts out there and see what you guys do with it.
Thank you. And then, yeah, Benjamin, Daniel, me, Nance, we'll just kind of take notes on all of your guys' things here, and then we'll do our closing remarks. Cesar, what's up, man?
Hey, do I sound clear? Good. So the most immediate thought that came to my head from what Daniel was saying about just the possibilities of doing things uh, made me go back to Jacques Ellul and his critique of technique, and how we could get kind of like technique brained about things where we only ever think about rationale or rationality, and things like efficiency as the only possibilities that should exist. Um, and I'm not, it just making me think how that's kind of interesting to think in a political sense too, of if you're only ever thinking of democracy and politics in a way where it only has to be about efficiency or rationality or a certain logic, as opposed to maybe a democracy that allows the messiness of human possibilities and like inefficiency, um, and playfulness to kind of take its place, have its own area. Um, so I'm not sure if I have a question in that, more so just or maybe the question would be if anybody, Benjamin, Daniel, or others have ideas of this idea of things only being efficient, like we could say AI as the current mode of things, um, having a certain logic to it where it doesn't then allow certain other possibilities to take place, and how that interacts with our thinking of democracy.
Thank you. We have time for one more, Rebecca.
All right, so like, I didn't have like a specific thought or a specific question, but there was something I just kept kind of returning to in my head, both from listening to today and listening to some of the other discussions that have happened over the past couple days. In particular, it's around this notion of intractable disagreement that I find extremely fascinating and interesting, mostly because I kind of like since I first read Alenka Supancic's What is Sex, I've thought about the non-relation or contradiction and the role that that plays in different sort of like processes, different sorts of like attempts at creating social structures in one way or another. And I was sort of thinking about the way that she had talked about the non-relation as actually the condition of the bond, right? Like, so the non-relation isn't necessarily the meaning that there is no possibility of a bond. It's not a pessimism about the sexual relation, but rather it's about the very condition in the space of contradiction, in the space of antagonism or intractable difference, that there is through that the means of establishing a certain sort of like connection or structure. And so I was just kind of thinking about the way in which, like, in a space, a political or social space where contradiction, intractable disagreement is repressed or is not allowed to occur or take place, like, is that in many ways, it seems like that's kind of like trying to make uh like kind of going along with what's been said before, that that is precisely not politics. It's erasing the actual space for politics, right? And also likewise, and this is just sort of me thinking out loud, I guess, but I was thinking about the way in which, like, if in some way we can maybe talk about history as occurring uh, through the advance of contradiction in one way or another, right? In different ways, like the progression of different sort of intractable contradictions, disagreements, conflicts, and how that sort of like is maybe you could say like the main like propulsion of the historical movement. Then, like, once again, going back to this, like, this idea of a friction-free society or a society without contradiction, a society without disagreement, like, I feel as though there's something maybe at the level of an ideological or like phantasmatic level, like some sort of a desire for like a stasis, right? Like, even in the most accelerationist sort of fantasy, right? The idea that there is no conflict or no like possibility for like obstacles or blockades. Like ultimately, I feel as though there's something about that which speaks to ultimately some kind of a fantasy of not moving at all, really. no real change. But anyway, these are just my random thoughts. So there you go.
Thank you. Then Nance, Daniel, Benjamin.
Yeah, again, I want to thank all of the people participating in this conversation, and just one more time, a special little bit of the specialness of kind of what we've done over the last few days, being able to be with people and continue the conversation. And it has often found its way back to these questions of communication versus conversation, the questions of are we technique? Are we just kind of math? Are we just 1 + 1 = 2, or is there room for variability and ambiguity, and the ethical and the kind of ethical dimension, dealing with intractable disagreements? And when you come up against a problem that shouldn't be solved with just a kind of ubiquitous algebraic placeholder best practices, but it should come down to the kind of singular individuals in the moment, in the context, in the situation, dealing with the problem together collaboratively, not looking for total satisfaction, but looking for maybe a dissatisfaction that just works for everybody. And that's kind of the best solution. And fighting back against like the machine that would have us all kind of flattened out, and opening space for our variability and our dimensionality as humans. And again, I often will say I don't care about politics. Politics don't matter to me. Democracy doesn't matter to me. Like I will say these things because I don't know, they're hard questions to answer. They're hard things to deal with. And from my experience, there's just no, like I've never had any efficacy with that. But attempting to develop a kind of platform, space, non-space, place, technology, technique, whatever, to have conversation with other people in the real world, I think is a political act. And so maybe I do actually really care about politics a whole lot. And maybe we should stop thinking about politics as grand solutions, and politics as like the kind of in situ, embodied, kind of like in media res things that we deal with every day as political subjects. I guess what I'm trying to say is I can't disavow my political nature as someone who is, whether I like it or not, participating in politics. And I think all my friends here who've helped me come to that realization, and also who are doing the same as well.
Magnificent. I've really enjoyed this. So first, there's a wonderful book, Rez. You mentioned Postman. He has another book on reclaiming like the 18th century. There's a book called The Invention of News by, I think, Pearson's, talking about how, when the printed word began, and he goes through all these technological sort of inventions and printing and how people related to it. Like today, we believe that if it's not printed, you can't trust it. When it first came out, how can you trust something printed when you don't have someone face to face, right? There are all these kind of social expectations that shift. And one of the things that also can happen is when the pamphlet first comes out, it can be kind of exciting and inspiring. And it's like, wow, okay. And it can feel like it's bringing you into a new world. But with time, that acceleration is can lose that sort of feeling of being brought into something new and just becomes ho-hum. And then it actually can turn into its opposite, right? But in turning into its opposite, it can actually leave a feeling of a need to get back to some sort of invitation into something, right? I think also basically, this is what you were saying on technique. Yeah, basically, democracy, if it is democracy, will not allow us to get into a single path. It will actually have us be multidimensional so that we don't end up hitting some sort of impasse and we get stuck, right? Which suggests we have a problem at this point. And I think with the interactive, like you were saying, Rebecca, so well, I guess if I would just to speak quickly on the point, democracy for me, if it were to actually be a thing, as opposed to this event that comes and goes, would have something to do where the social plausibility structures and notions of what one does would lend in the direction of conversation and ultimately some sort of orbiting around these intractable disagreements in a manner that is constructive to then keep the conversation going. And the plausibility structure of that society would also be one that makes you feel as if it is not immoral or betraying your beliefs to actually go with the consensus of the group, right? Plausibility structure, Peter Berger, and all those different things, right? Until you have that, you will not have a democracy that is any more than a glimmer that comes and goes. But the main challenge is, to summarize what, for me, democracy right now has to face the tendency of human beings to outsource our thinking to our values and our ideas, to our abstractions. It has to somehow figure out the problem of military self-defense. It has to deal with the problem of anxiety, which is explaining yourself to other people and feeling like you're not doing a job. So this anxiety. And the last one that comes to mind is the problem of the moral real. When other people are doing something that is a moral atrocity to you, how do you relate to those? Those are four things that come to mind as the problem of maintaining democracy beyond an event. And I see no way to even begin an address of that conversation unless we start thinking about creating a social that creates a plausibility structure in the way we describe for conversation, and then makes it plausible that going with where that conversation arrives at does not make you a bad person or betraying your beliefs or something like that. In fact, that is the thing a good citizen, if you will, would in fact do. So those are some thoughts. It's been a treat.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Lots of different things to think about, more than there's time to properly go over. But I suppose I'll say this. While the way the military works has changed enormously, and it's become much more centralized, it's still the case that when there are military orders, human beings, people, have to follow those orders. And those people may now be concentrated into a different kind of apparatus from the kinds of apparatuses that existed historically, but they're still people, and they still have to do the things they're told to do. And so while the kind of apparatus that constitutes them, socializes them, that they go through, to some degree limits what you can do, as long as there are still people there, there's somebody there you can potentially interface with and reach. There's somebody there who has to actually do the work of making you go back to work if you are out in the street. And as long as that's the case, there is possibility for people. It's once all of it is machines and it's all technology, and it's a given that the robots will do exactly what the central command tells them to do. Once you get to that stage, then it's done. And not just democracy, politics is done at that point, because there's no longer legitimating going on. There's no longer intractable disagreement. There's you do what the machines tell you to do or they kill you. So we are still in this window where there are people who have to follow orders for things to happen. And that's really the amazing thing about this world. It's such a complicated world. It seems so difficult that people could be involved with it at all at this point. But still, it operates on the basis that people do things that somebody tells them to do because they've been persuaded on some level that they should. Even if they're not sure, even if they have their reservations, they still act. This is the incredible system that people have built. People, and it's still ours for now.
I was going to say the whole thing, but I think that's a perfect point to end on. And I just think we can come back and keep talking about this more soon after Mikey's book launch, which is in 2 days here in, where we're headed, Kansas City, Missouri. And I think it's related to what Benjamin just said. Dr. Laura Johnson will be there. She'll be talking about this as well. Robo Cthulhu, right? Holding it right here, holding it up to the camera. This is the draft copy of Mikey's book. And so, while there's still people who can not, as opposed to machines that just will. Let's get after it. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Take care. Oh, and for the people who are here on the Zoom call, stick around for at least 3 minutes. Ask everybody else what they thought about it once we're out of the picture. And also anybody here, everybody here is welcome to stick around a little bit. I'm going to go join my wife in the hot tub. Maybe I'll see a few of you down there as well. Take care, everybody. Peace.
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Theory Underground exists to cultivate the conditions necessary for a working-class intellectual renaissance that goes beyond old political categories or other identitarian niches. At TU, autodidact workers with earbuds and professionals who see no future in existing institutions or movements are able to challenge their doxa and develop an understanding of the situation we are in.
If you subscribe at theoryunderground.com, you'll get access to a package of courses, including my Intro to Fault Line Theory, which includes Intro to Nick Land and Intro to Slavoj Žižek. These courses are being woven with the 3 courses that take place on a month-to-month basis, spread out throughout the year of 2025. Those courses are 12 Core Concepts and the Fundamental Problems with the Situation Today with social theorist David McKerracher, 12 Essential Political Thinkers with political theorist Benjamin Studebaker, and The Philosophy of Nature with philosopher Nina Power.
The way these all get woven together at a deeper and more meta level is through the ongoing research seminars led by David McKerracher, Benjamin Studebaker, and Michael Downs, where they engage with one another's work by sharing developments from their own perspectives, theory, and research.
If you subscribe at higher levels and support our work, we'll support your development with bespoke teaching. Alone and unaided, we struggle to grasp our situation in its fullness and formulate a meaningful response. By working together and pooling our energies, we can do better. Join us at theoryunderground.com/subscribe.
There'll be 2 kinds of people in 10 years. Those who said, I knew all along Theory Underground was going to make this huge difference. Those are the people that are like Nance, who were on the sidelines at one point and then said, nah, I'm going to get in. I'm going to roll up my sleeves and I'm going to go hard. And then there's another kind of person, a person who waits in the wings, collects receipts, and who will say in 10 years, oh yeah, I was there. I saw that happen. And then they'll gossip monger. Listen, if you want to get involved, get involved. But if you're going to sit there in the bleachers, well, here's some popcorn. I hope you have fun.